The glass hit the floor before anyone moved. Park Junho didn't flinch. He sat at table 7 with the kind of stillness that came from decades of watching other people clean up his messes, his silk tie loosened just enough to look powerful rather than careless, his 3 associates arranged around him like satellites orbiting a sun that had never once considered burning out. The restaurant buzzed around them, soft jazz, the clink of wine glasses, the low hum of a Tuesday evening crowd who had no idea what kind of man they were sharing air with. The waitress crouched down and began picking up the broken pieces with her bare hands. Junho watched her. Then he leaned toward his associate, Kim Dae-soo, and said in Korean, low and lazy, "Look at her hands shake. These people come here thinking a pretty face is a career." He chuckled. Dae-soo chuckled. The other 2 men smiled because that was what you did when Park Junho found something amusing. The waitress didn't look up. She was maybe 28, with dark hair pulled back tight and an expression that had been carefully engineered to say nothing. Her name tag read Mia. Her hands, for the record, were not shaking. She placed the broken glass pieces into a folded napkin with the focused precision of someone who had done much harder things than this, stood up slowly, and turned to face the table. Junho looked at her the way he looked at furniture. "We'll need another bottle," he said. In English. "Barely." She nodded. "Turn to go." Then he added, in Korean again, "Just loud enough, and try not to drop this one. Some of us actually have places to be." More laughter. Dae-soo covered his mouth. One of the younger men pulled out his phone, already bored. Mia stopped walking. She stood with her back to them for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned around, and she looked directly at Park Junho, and she said, in flawless Korean, not textbook Korean, not tourist Korean, but Seoul district, back alley, negotiation room Korean, "You shouldn't be here tonight." The laughter stopped. Junho's smile stayed on his face for a moment through sheer muscle memory before his brain caught up and told it to leave. He stared at her. She stared back. Something moved behind her eyes. Not fear, not anger, something colder and more deliberate than either. "What did you just say to me?" he asked. She didn't repeat herself. She simply held his gaze for one more breath, then walked calmly toward the kitchen, the broken glass folded neatly in her napkin, as if she hadn't just dropped a grenade on the table and walked away from the blast radius. Park Junho sat very still. For the first time in a long time, he did not know what to do next. 3 hours earlier, Mia had arrived at Osteria Noma through the service entrance, the way she always did when she wasn't supposed to exist. She had worked a kitchen shift twice before at this location, enough to know the layout, enough to memorize the fire exits, enough to have a conversation with the head sommelier named Thomas who believed she was a culinary school graduate from Portland covering shifts for extra income. Thomas was not wrong about the extra income part. She changed into the restaurant's uniform in the staff room, tied her hair back, and stood in front of the small mirror above the lockers for a moment. Not vanity. Assessment. She checked the angle of the name tag, the way the collar sat, whether anything about her looked like anything other than what she needed to look like. Then she walked out into the dining room and became Mia the waitress, and Mia the waitress had been doing this job for 3 years and had absolutely no opinion about anything except whether your steak was cooked correctly. The reservation had come in under a shell name, it always did with Junho. His people were careful. But not careful enough, because the reservation had been made from a number traced to a burner phone purchased 2 blocks from an address the task force had been watching for 11 months, and that was the kind of coincidence that wasn't. She had her earpiece in, disguised as a small piece of clear medical tape near her jaw, the kind worn by people with hearing aids. The channel was quiet. It would stay quiet unless something changed. The dining room filled up the way expensive restaurants always did, slowly, deliberately, with the particular confidence of people who had never once worried about the bill. Mia moved between tables and learned the room the way she had been trained to learn rooms, cataloging exits and occupants and the subtle topography of who was watching whom. At 7:43, Park Junho walked in. She had studied his file long enough that seeing him in person felt almost anticlimactic. He was shorter than she expected, they usually were. But the energy was right. He moved through the restaurant's entrance with the presumption of a man who had never once been told to wait, and the host, to his credit, did not make him wait, which meant the reservation had been flagged the way she'd requested. He was seated at table 7. She was assigned table 7. She took his table's drink order from a distance first, let one of the other servers bring the initial bread, stayed in his peripheral vision without entering it directly. She watched him the way she watched everyone she needed to understand, not with interest, but with attention. There was a difference. Interest made you lean in. Attention kept you level. Junho was performing. That was the first thing she noticed. The laughter was slightly too loud. The gestures were slightly too broad. He was putting on a show for his associates, which meant he was either nervous or compensating, and men like Park Junho did not get nervous in restaurants. Which meant something else was going on at this table tonight. She filed that away and went to get their first bottle of wine. By 9 o'clock, the restaurant had reached its comfortable peak, every table occupied, the kitchen firing at full rhythm, the jazz soft enough to allow conversation and loud enough to prevent it from being overheard. Mia had served table 7 their appetizers, cleared 2 plates, and refreshed the bread twice. She had made herself pleasant and invisible, which was the highest art form of her particular kind of work. Junho had not looked at her once with any real attention. That changed when Dae-soo, deep in his 3rd glass of burgundy, said something in Korean about the waitress being decorative, and Junho had smiled the particular smile of a man who had just been given permission to be worse than he already was. The bottle went over the edge, Junho knocked it with his elbow, or perhaps he knocked it deliberately, the way powerful men sometimes created small disasters just to watch someone else absorb the consequences. Mia was there in under 10 seconds, crouching, collecting, keeping her face completely neutral even as she felt the cold wine seeping through the knee of her black trousers. She heard every word he said. Her Korean was better than his. That was the irony that lived quietly at the center of everything. She had spent 14 months in Seoul, embedded in a cultural liaison position that was ostensibly diplomatic and was actually nothing of the sort, and she had learned the language the way you learn a language when your life depends on the nuances, on the difference between I think and I know and I am certain, on the particular weight certain words carry in certain mouths in certain rooms. When he made the comment about her hands, she felt something pull tight in her chest. Not humiliation. Impatience. Because she needed this table to stay calm and contained, and men who showed off were men who made mistakes that changed the shape of an evening. And then she stopped. And she turned around. And she told him he shouldn't be here tonight, because it was true, and because some part of her that existed outside the mission and outside the training and outside the careful architecture of Mia the waitress needed him to know, just for 1 second, that he was not the most dangerous person in this room. She brought the new bottle. She opened it at the table, poured it smoothly, set it on the ice stand beside them, and did everything with the unhurried competence of someone who had not just detonated something between them. But she could feel Junho watching her differently now. The lazy disregard was gone. In its place was something sharper and more uncertain, and uncertain men were the kind that either retreated or escalated, and Park Junho did not look like a man who retreated. "Where did you learn Korean?" he asked. "Quiet now." "In Korean." "I lived there for a while," she said, also in Korean, pouring Dae-soo's glass without looking at Junho. "Where?" "Mapogu," she said, which was true. "Mostly near the river." Silence. She could feel Dae-soo and the other 2 men recalibrating, the way people did when a conversation shifted language and suddenly they were no longer performing for an audience that couldn't understand them. "You speak well," Junho said carefully. "Thank you." She capped the bottle. "Is there anything else I can get you?" He studied her. She could feel the study, the way he was trying to reclassify her, to find the file in his mental system where she belonged, because every person he encountered existed in a category and she had just refused to be placed in the obvious one. "Sit down," he said. "I'm working," she said pleasantly. I'm asking you to sit down. And I'm telling you politely that I can't. She smiled, not the empty smile she'd been using all evening, but a different one, smaller and cleaner. But I'll check on you in a few minutes. She walked away. In her earpiece, for the first time all evening, she heard a voice. It was her handler, a man she knew only as Reston, and what he said was, movement on the east side. 2 vehicles. We think the Shin crew just arrived. Her pace didn't change. She moved through the dining room, past table 4 with their dessert order, past the service station, into the narrow corridor that led toward the kitchen, and she pressed 2 fingers briefly against the side of her jaw. How many? She said, barely moving her lips. At least 6. They're not coming in the front. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. The Shin crew. Of course. 11 months of surveillance, and the thing she had not fully accounted for was that someone else had been running their own parallel operation, and that operation had apparently led them to the same restaurant on the same night, and the reason Park Junho had been performing all evening was not arrogance, it was anxiety, because somewhere in the architecture of his careful, well-protected criminal life, a wall had cracked, and he knew it, and he had come here tonight anyway because men like him sometimes chose defiance over wisdom. She needed to get him out. Not because she cared about Park Junho. She was very clear with herself about this, she did not care about Park Junho. She cared about 18 months of evidence, about a case that had been built with the patience of people who believed that patience was its own form of justice, about the trial that could not happen if the defendant was carried out of an Italian restaurant in the meatpacking district by a rival organization with a different kind of verdict in mind. She turned around and walked back to table 7. Mr. Park, she said, pulling out the chair across from him and sitting down without asking, which made Dae-soo actually flinch. I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to do it without making a scene. Junho stared at her. What? The people who have been looking for you found you 20 minutes ago. They're entering through the kitchen service door in approximately 4 minutes. She kept her voice at the conversational volume of someone discussing the evening specials. I need you to stand up calmly, thank me for an excellent meal, and follow me toward the front of the restaurant. The color left Junho's face by degrees, like water draining from a basin. Who are you? He said. Someone who needs you alive and in a courtroom, she said. Which right now makes me the best friend you have in this building. Dae-soo reached inside his jacket. Mia's hand moved to his wrist before he got there, not grabbing, just placing, a point of contact that communicated something precise and wordless and completely outside the vocabulary of restaurant service. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He put his hand back on the table. 2 minutes, Reston said in her ear. We're moving, she said, aloud this time, and Junho heard it and understood she wasn't talking to him. She stood. She looked at Junho with the full, direct attention she'd been withholding all evening, and something in her expression must have reached the part of him that had survived this long by recognizing real danger from performed danger, because he stood up. Smoothly. Like a man who had chosen this. He straightened his jacket and dropped his napkin on the chair and said to Dae-soo, leave it, when Dae-soo reached for his phone. They moved. Mia led them through the dining room at the pace of a completely normal end-of-meal departure, unhurried, fluid, threading between tables with the practiced ease of someone who had spent the evening learning every inch of this room. She nodded at a couple near the window. She paused for one beat at the host stand to say something brief to Thomas, who looked mildly confused but nodded, and that one beat was not wasted because it was the beat in which she confirmed with a glance through the front glass that the extraction vehicle was where it was supposed to be. Behind them, from the corridor near the kitchen, she heard the sound of a door opening. Go, she said. They went. The night air hit cold and direct. The vehicle, a dark gray SUV that looked like every other dark gray SUV in Manhattan, was running. Reston was in the passenger seat. 2 other people Junho had never seen were in the back. Dae-soo and the associates were folded in with the efficiency of people who had spent significant time practicing how to fold other people into vehicles. Junho was last. He stood on the sidewalk for one moment that he perhaps could not help, looking back at the restaurant, at the warm light inside, at the world he'd been occupying 15 minutes ago as if it still existed and he could still return to it. Then he looked at Mia, who was standing beside the open door, and his expression had shed most of what it had been carrying all evening. What was left was something that looked, against all probability, like embarrassment. "You understood everything I said," he said. "In there. From the beginning." "Yes," she said. He processed this in the particular way that people processed having been heard when they believed they were invisible, which was, slowly, and with a particular quality of reckoning that could not be rushed. "The thing about her hands," he said. "I heard it." He said nothing. A taxi passed. Somewhere half a block north there were sounds that were not concerning from this distance, but that meant it was time. "Get in," she said. He got in. She didn't ride with them. She went back into the restaurant because Mia the waitress still had 4 tables, and abandoning 4 tables in the middle of service would create the kind of memory that she did not need anyone to have. She served dessert to table 3. She took the check to table 9. She chatted briefly with the couple near the window who asked if the jazz was live and she said no, not on Tuesdays, and smiled a smile that cost her nothing. An hour later she changed out of the uniform in the staff locker room, said goodnight to Thomas, walked out through the service entrance, and stood for a moment in the alley behind the restaurant. She breathed. The earpiece was silent. The case was intact. The 18 months had not unraveled on a Tuesday in November because one man had decided that a woman who could not understand him was the safest audience for his worst self. She almost smiled at that. She started walking. Reston would debrief her in the morning, timeline, risk assessment, whether the Shin crew's appearance had been coincidence or coordination, what it meant for the broader case. There were reports to write and decisions to be made in a trial that was still months away and could still fail for a dozen reasons that had nothing to do with tonight. But tonight had worked. And sometimes that was the only thing that could be true. She reached the corner, pulled her regular jacket tighter against the cold, and waited for the light. On the other side of the street the city continued being itself, loud, indifferent, full of rooms where people said things they believed would never be heard by the wrong ears.